Hey everybody, my name's Josh Berkus. As mentioned, I work for RedHat. I'm on our community team where I get the privilege of working on Kubernetes, the project itself. One of the things that I actually do for the Kubernetes project is I serve on the release team and SIG-Release, who are in charge of actually pushing out the bits that are called Kubernetes. Which is what I wanted to actually talk to you a little bit about today in terms of what happens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SIG-Release, what that is and what we do, what the release process for Kubernetes is, what our planned release cycle is, then explain what the release team is and the various team roles, and then tell you actually how you could get involved. Because it's actually a good way to get involved in contributing and participating in the Kubernetes project, even if you haven't done it before. So, this is our mission, our essential mission for my charter. So the first thing I actually want to stop back and explain is what a SIG is. So, for those of you who have not been involved in the Kubernetes project as a project, it's a huge project with a whole lot of code, and like 40 or 50 different companies with staff contributing to it, plus some associated, plus some individuals on their own, with a lot of different sort of segments. And so very early on, the project founders decided that we were going to divide up the project, and this is before I actually started contributing, divide up the project into different teams, each of which would have a focus. And sometimes that focus is a technical focus, like SIG Network that's in charge of virtual networking for Kubernetes, etc., or SIG Auth that's deceptively named because, well, they are in charge of authentication stuff, but they're really in charge of the security issues. And then some of these SIGs actually have a process focus. One of the ones I participate in a lot is SIG Contributor Experience, that is actually focused on managing all of the contributors to Kubernetes. And then the other one is SIG-Release, and SIG-Release's job is to release Kubernetes. And importantly, to continuously improve the release process and the release tooling, and to make sure that we have the right stuff in each release. So that said, let's get a sort of poll thing. How many people know how many times a year we release Kubernetes? A couple. Anyone who doesn't want to take a guess? So 4 releases a year. We haven't been more than 2 weeks late since version 1.8. Successfully, and I don't actually think we're going to miss a schedule again because we've got a much better system down. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we do that, and why we do that. While I'm at it, actually, I wanted to drop a survey link in here, because one of the things we've started talking about is Kubernetes is a high-velocity project, which means that some vendors have started asking us for an LTS, a long-term support release. We're not sure whether we even want to do that or not. So SIG-Release has actually put up a survey there. And for any of you who are using Kubernetes in your organization, or for that matter, consulting on supporting Kubernetes for other customers, if you could actually fill out that survey, we would really appreciate it, because we're trying to get the idea of how people upgrade, how they look at upgrade cycles, which versions of Kubernetes they're running, and that sort of thing. So we can make an intelligent decision on whether or not to do an LTS release, and if so, what it'll look like. So, but let's talk about that release every 3 months. So this release every 3 months breaks down into a process of different phases over this 3-month period. So during the beginning of it, what we're asking everyone to do who works on the technical parts of Kubernetes is to come up with definitions of enhancements. By the way, if you see this going back a little bit, we used to call them features, but we realized that features was kind of confusing nomenclature, and so we switched to enhancements, as in these are specifically things that change how Kubernetes functions in some way that's obviously supposed to be better. And so starting this last release, we now actually require every enhancement to have an accompanying document, something called a KEP, which stands for Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal. It's a concept we borrowed from Python. In order to document the enhancement, what it's supposed to have in it, what its upgrade and downgrade procedure are, what its and what accompanying tests it's going to have. Obviously, for minor enhancements, this document would be quite short. For major work like adding a whole new facility or a new object to Kubernetes, the enhancement document can be several pages long. So then, moving on from the enhancement thing, eventually what we say is, okay, these are the list of all of the enhancements or less that are going to get into this release cycle for Kubernetes, because the others are just not well enough spec'd yet. And so people continue to work on that, and there's usually some back and forth and reviving the enhancement thing and that sort of thing. And then eventually, by about week 9, we go into what's called code freeze, which many of you be familiar with from development, right? And what code freeze means in Kubernetes is we stop accepting any changes to the enhancements. If something has to be changed, then it's going to be pulled and put into the next version. And we try to stabilize the code for release. Part of the reason why we need to stabilize the code is that end-to-end testing for Kubernetes is kind of a problem. Which is, we have lots of what are end-to-end tests, which are build a cluster, try to do a whole bunch of stuff on it, see if anything fails. We also have a bunch of what are called conformance tests that say, hey, if this API wasn't supposed to change, we need to make sure that it didn't change. Or that if it did change, it only changed in documented and therefore test scripted ways. And as you can see, because Kubernetes is a large, complicated infrastructure with hundreds, thousands of different variables, there's a question of what cloud you're going to deploy it to, what sort of plugins you're going to have, what kind of storage you're going to use. We try to do a sort of mix and match thing to get as much code coverage as possible, but there's a certain amount of combinatorics which makes it very hard to stabilize the tests. After we go through that, we go through 12 weeks of releases, bug fixing, and then we have a slight overlap with the next release cycle. Well, we are doing final sort of packaging and just making sure that the test infrastructure remains calm, because we have a lot of tests that require really slow runs. Things like the 5,000 node scalability test takes an entire day to run, so we need to actually watch it for a couple of days to make sure that nothing's broken in that regard. And then we actually go ahead and release the new version of Kubernetes. And then it goes into maintenance. Now, right now, the Kubernetes policy is that we actually support patch releases for three releases at a time. So, for example, if this was about 3 months ago and 1.12 was the current version, then 1.12, 1.11, 1.10 would be all receiving patch releases for any updates. Like, for example, has anybody not patched Kubernetes in a couple of weeks? No? Okay. For example, you may have, for people who have patched Kubernetes recently, you may have noticed that we've upgraded to Go 1.12, which we had to do because Golang is not supporting the earlier versions anymore, and there was a security fix. And so we run into some of those sorts of things, which can create instability for the users, but we don't really have a choice. But that's why we limit the window and do overlapping development between each version and then patching previous versions. Like a lot of other, production grade projects and that sort of thing, features are not introduced in older versions, right? Only bug fixes. Sometimes a feature may be introduced as a side effect of a bug fix, particularly for some of the security stuff, but it's not planned for anything to be introduced. So basically only critical fixes get backported. The older the version is, the less likely they are to be backported. So if you're already in a version that's 3 versions old, then you'll see that it's actually getting patched less often. Part of that is because new features get patched more often, right? So if a feature was introduced in 1.12, it's going to tend to get patched for the next 6 months or so while we discover issues with it in corner cases and other things. Whereas by the time a release is ready to go end of life, then it's getting patched a whole lot less. So currently, the stable version is 1.13. Just to warn you, 1.10 is already officially out of support by the project. Now, if you have a supporting vendor, the vendor may be backporting additional patches past what the project supports, which is always an option and one of the reasons why people get vendor support. But 1.10 is already end of life as far as any project patching is concerned. 1.11 is going to go end of life in about a month. So that means you have about 9 months to actually force an upgrade. Now, one of the other things that I actually want to talk about here is the release team. So you notice that we have these overlapping release cycles. And the way that we actually sustain that is that each release has its own individual release team. These release teams have some overlapping personnel, but there's a separate release lead and a separate team for each one. So for example, this here is the 1.12 release team. And the release team is divided up into a number of different roles. You have a release lead. You have the features now enhancements lead, got renamed, that's in charge of all of the organizing all the enhancements coming in, CI signal for testing, test infra for maintaining debugging the test infrastructure itself, if that's required, bug triage should be obvious, branch manager that actually handles the physical branching and packaging of bits, documentation, release notes, communications, which is all the announcements and PR and everything else, and then patch release manager who takes over after the official release. The patch release manager position has recently been reorganized into a floating patch release team that's not that rotates responsibilities among the current releases because mainly because the patch managers were getting lonely because by the time they start their job, everyone else on the release team is left. So the patch managers now have their own team. Now, one of the things that you may actually notice in here is we have this huge column here called shadow names, etc. And that's because in order to have multiple release teams, sometimes 2 at a time that are active, with 14 people on them, we are always recruiting. And the way that this works is you volunteer to join the release team as a shadow for one or more of these positions. I mean, you won't actually be selected for, you'll only be selected for one, but you might volunteer for more than one. And then the section lead for that particular position will pick their shadows out of the people who volunteered. There's an actual application process. We'll pick out of the volunteered, and then you will become sort of an intern doing some work in that role. Like in the various rotations, I've done bug triage and CI signal and enhancements lead, because I rotate on and off this. And what the shadows end up doing is that, like, I'll say, okay, you are in charge of watching all of the performance tests for this next week. And I want you to follow them, and I want you to file issues and pester SIG scalability if anything fails. And it's a good way to actually learn the job. It's also a good way to learn the project, because when you're on the release team, you find that you actually have to contact people from all over the Kubernetes project in order to get stuff done. And because you're on the release team, they are friendly to you and they respect you. You know, you go and you say, hey, I'm Amit from the release team, and this test that you submitted really doesn't work, and it's causing the test boards to fail, and could you please patch it and resubmit it? And people understand how important and how time constrained the release cycle is, and they actually respond to that. And then the idea here is that once you've learned the job as a shadow, like you get recruited as a shadow with the idea that you're going to actually, you know, barring a life change for you, take over the role in the next cycle. And that's how it works for a large number of people, where you move up from shadow to taking over the role, and then you usually take a release cycle or off, because it can be somewhat stressful, particularly in the last couple of weeks of the release, for a lot of the roles, particularly things like CI signal, bug triage, and of course the lead. So you'll want to take a cycle off and do something else. Also, it's a lot of fun, because we have teams. The teams meet regularly. We do stuff. We have silly team t-shirts. This is Left Shark, which was for the 110 release, theme of the 110 release. And you actually get to learn a lot of the other parts of the project and how they're put together in order to actually get stuff released on time. I can explain any of the roles to you if we do it later, but I think I went over them briefly, and they're not that hard to understand, particularly because all these roles actually have handbooks. Now, not all the handbooks are 100% complete, but there's pretty good documentation on, what happened there? On what you're expected to do and when you are expected to do it. And we try to improve the documentation with every single release cycle so that the next team is in a better position to take on the responsibilities. Also because we change things about the release process periodically. Like previously, we used to have a period of about 6 days before code freeze we called code slush. And in the last release, we decided having that period wasn't really useful because nobody actually did anything different during code slush. So we got rid of it. SIG-Release also does other things. One of the other reasons that we actually spent a lot of time training people up to do the actual release is that in the early days of SIG-Release, all we did was push out the release because we needed everybody that we could get our hands on. Well, now we've had a lot of volunteers who've been on the release team, and we have a pool of people who can do the releases. We've actually started to be able to work on long-term priorities for Kubernetes releases. So there's a release engineering team that specifically works on all of our release tools, many of which were created for the Kubernetes project. Tide is an example of that. Tide is a bot that manages merges on GitHub, including merges of cherry picks and a bunch of other things. It's created for the Kubernetes project. I know now a couple of other projects are using it. Licensing, as in licensing of dependencies, has also fallen under the responsibility of SIG-Release. And we're in the middle of another licensing audit because sometimes people include things in their features without checking how it's licensed. Not that anyone here would ever do that. And of course, the new long-term support working group, trying to figure out if we're going to have long-term support, if so, what it's going to look like. And again, let me plug the survey, because as users of Kubernetes, we really need your feedback on what looks reasonable for that. So one of the other things I want to actually emphasize here is, so how many people here are Go programmers? Okay, we have lots of things for you to do. But for the rest of you who are not Go programmers, the release team is one of the areas you can get involved in Kubernetes without being a Go programmer. Because most of the roles on that release team do not require you to write any code. I mean, if you can write code, there's opportunities for that, but it's not required at all. These are mostly coordination, documentation, tracking type roles. So if you've been looking at a place to get involved and haven't been sure of that, you can get involved there. So having presented that, I'm happy to take some questions. We update the documentation with every release. Actually, well, the documentation actually gets updated continuously because it's online. But the major updates to the documentation happen with the releases, right? Because there's going to be a whole bunch of new documentation that is tied to the new features. And the documentation team has a really complicated job of keeping track of which bits of documentation are tied to a new feature and which bits of documentation are updating things for an old feature and therefore could and should go in immediately. Which they do. They do keep track of that. And we have a really big SIG documentation who are constantly looking for people to contribute to and edit the documentation. So I don't actually work on OKD. OKD gets updated for some but not all Kubernetes releases. OpenShift has a lot of functionality that's not in core Kubernetes, some of which unfortunately still requires patching the Kubernetes code. Like we would like for it to all be plugins, but we haven't quite gotten there. And as a result, sometimes we skip a release on that. And so, for example, I think OKD as well as OpenShift went straight from 1.9 to 111 and did not do a 110 for that reason. And for that matter, honestly, you know, OKD is the open source distribution of Red Hat's OpenShift, and Red Hat's customers are enterprise customers, so they're not necessarily all that interested in having more frequent updates. They're more interested in stability. Good question. So most of the test infrastructure actually runs in Google Cloud. We've got a huge donated pool of servers in Google Cloud. And mostly GCP instances. And we run a whole bunch of tests on that. I mean, after all, when Kubernetes was first launched, it actually was, all of the tests were just ways to test GCP and GKE. And then we've gradually added other stuff. There are some specific tests that run on AWS cloud servers. We currently do not have any automated bare metal testing. We talk about it a lot. Nobody's come up with a way to arrange it in a way that could be under the management of a distributed multi-company test infrastructure team. Yep. Thank you.